our a second meeting of future historians this January 2118, and we're here to put on our future historians' hats and look backward at the terrible struggles and terrible sufferings of the early 20th century and try to imagine a better world and, most importantly, ways to get from then 2018 to now, a livable, basically egalitarian world. So, in the under the heading of then, what we have are evidence of violence and brutality and killing and mass destruction, and also of the environment, such as I've never been able to imagine. And my earliest memories were of Dachau and Hiroshima, because I'm a pre-war baby. So this seems to me something that needs to be looked at, understood, and historical context, so that looking at it from 100 years, our readers will see how endemic it was to the dying capitalist system. And we now face the question of how to move forward, how to get out of it. And in the history of revolutions, the whole question has been the struggle over power. And that struggle over power, violent forms. So our subject today is to see if there what remains of that long tradition of uprisings and violent attempts of the state, and what we can learn from all kinds of earlier movements that used force, but not armed violence. And so I had asked Mati Mongib, to us from Rabat, Morocco, to join us, but I don't know what's happened. He hasn't been. I spoke to him by phone last night. And Peter Hudis, who has also thought long about this question in Chicago. But so let's start on this discussion. And since Sam has got to leave early, please let him go first. That's what I was about to suggest.
Yeah, Sam, go ahead, and I'm in the wiki, so I'll take notes.
I don't really have a lot prepared here. I mean, you know, that I guess there's something supposedly, you know, interesting about this idea of being able to destroy everything through nuclear warfare, or you know, we're going to burn huge quantities of fossil fuels and put lots of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and transform the globe so quickly that everything will just die, you know. Or I mean, the thing is, right, that Jason Moore has always been fundamentally correct about this, that capitalism is a cheapening of the world, and that this would be an interesting topic perhaps for a future discussion here, that we've always been kind of cheap for the system, and or cheap dates, perhaps, maybe that would be the good word. We've always been cheap dates for the system. And so at some point, the world of competing nation states was obliged, first off, to create a system in which the only real dreamable utopia was that of social democracy. You know, that transcending capitalism altogether wasn't really made into any sort of realistic utopian dream or the basis for one. Although, you know, I would argue that it's in the small scale projects that you see that the dream of transcending capitalism. And then we created a system in which, you know, you had opposing powers with nuclear weapons pointed at each other, right? United States and the Soviet Union, right? And that I mean, it's kind of insanity to have these things, right? Nothing is going to be accomplished by dropping nuclear weapons. Absolutely nothing at all. Nothing is going to be conquered, right? The land would be so thoroughly poisoned that nobody would want it. And so it's a sort of, you know, descent into mass insanity that accompanies these sorts of things. And I'm not really sure where I want to go forward with that in terms of would I write a chapter of my book about it or whatever. So I'm just going to leave it right there.
Are you, I'm sometimes confused, Sam, by your ironies, the multiple levels on which you talk. So I was looking at one of the papers that I signed was the introduction to Leakey's fundamental manual book on nonviolence. It introduces it, points out that when they took a poll of children in grammar school, you know, elementary school, what they thought of the future, 90% thought that the world was going to be blown up and that they wouldn't live. This was back in 1987. So, you know, I'm not sure. I think when you smile, is it because of the horror of this? So a form of denial, because I'll speak as an advocate now of nonviolence. And we people believe that until you come out of denial, recognize the reality of the danger, the immediacy of the danger, and the systemic nature of the danger, that you can't be effective and that movements won't be willing to take the necessary leaps of courage to overcome capitalism. And the only way I could see that happening is by using our strength against the 8 billionaires who apparently own the world and the guards that they're able to hire. So I want to know what was the point that you wanted to raise this morning?
Well, if we're going to talk about power and ultimately about nuclear power, then the problem with all of that seems to be a sort of descent into insanity, right? That there really is no point in using nuclear weapons, and yet the threat, you know, they make some kind of threat to use them, and that I mean, you saw this whole idea in the early 1970s with Richard Nixon, right, and his madman theory, you know, that he wanted to convey the impression to the the so-called North Vietnamese that he was insane and that he might do anything. And of course, it didn't work, right?
But he was insane, which is.
But it didn't work. It didn't work.
The present president is insane.
Yes, so, of course, they all are.
What would you say? I mean, clearly nuclear destruction is entirely pointless and mad. You're absolutely right. I mean, at the end of the day, it's like if they kill the last human, there's no one left to like clean their toilets. You know, I mean, it's just sort of, I mean, but what would you, in your mind, what's the next step? What's the path away? I think is that a little bit what you were hoping to move towards?
I just didn't understand his point at all, whether he was affirming that, yes, the days are numbered to humanity and other warm things on the earth, more and more limited, and that on the optimism-pessimism scale, I go up and down.
Perhaps it has something to do with this elite attitude of treating us all as cheap, right? That since we're all cheap, we're all easily disposable, and that, you know, they can easily imagine, you know, pushing the nuclear button and sending out bombs to kill us all, because after all, we're all cheap, you know. And so,
but don't they understand that includes them? Then they are insane.
Yeah, well,
so that's your diagnosis.
It
does, it's bad.
They are,
or psychosis only in the Nero class that is governing us, the Nero class, because the 1/10 of 1% this world, and put assholes like Trump in power and go along with him and back him, because the whole Republican Party and plenty of Democrats back him and all his crazy shit. And that what's his name, Obama, was doing crazy shit before him, supporting Saudi Arabia and all the rest of it.
So they're all front guys.
It's real or it isn't real. And what are we going to do about it?
Donald Trump's reality TV star, okay? He's a front guy. Yeah, he's a front guy. You have an oligarchy of rich people running things.
Yeah, we know that.
I'm going to jump in for a sec, because David has something. I'm not sure if we're going to get somewhere new at the moment, so I want to give David a chance to jump in. Oh, and someone else just joined us.
It looks like Peter Hudis with a beard.
No, it's me.
Dan. Good to see you. Wow. Okay. David, do you want to go ahead? David?
Yes. Let me go. Okay. I want to make a couple of points, bouncing off what Sam was saying. First of all, I would invite people to read A Critique of Jason Moore by Andreas Malm, the author of Fossil Capital. In particular, Malm's book researches, he thinks, and I'm convinced he's right, that coal was not cheaper than water power, but it was the ability of the capitalists to control labor that led to the Industrial Revolution and the use of coal. Okay, so I think it's oversimplified to talk about cheap nature and so on, without looking at the reproduction of capital in capitalist system more closely. Secondly, as far as nuclear power, I'm a very strong supporter of nuclear power. It's the fusion reactor in the sun. That's the kind of nuclear power that we should rely on. Okay, So I actually made this statement at the World Social Forum in Montreal, and one of the people on the panel thought I was defending fission power because he didn't understand the difference between fusion and fission. So now, on the question of nonviolence and armed self-defense, I think we should look at a long history of the complementary relation between the two. I had a roommate from Bangladesh who was very knowledgeable about the history of the movement in India and Bangladesh, and he pointed out that the massive nonviolent movement for independence in India was also right along with it was actually an armed self-defense movement. The same was true in the civil rights movement in the South. You had the Deacons for Defense in the South, and now we have, I think, and this too bad Brian is not with us yet, but Brian posted a very interesting piece about redneck revolt and how in rural areas there's armed self-defense gun clubs which are explicitly anti-capitalist. You should go to their website and read their stuff. It's very inspiring. Not that I'm going to join a gun club, but it's something to. I think it's oversimplified to argue that purely nonviolent movement is the answer. We also need forms of self-defense, certainly. Not that that becomes the predominant mode of the movement. So I'm going to mute myself.
Yes. Is someone else want to come in here, Alexei?
Yes, I think historically there have been two dangerous attitudes to the problem of political violence in socialist movement. The first is reliance on violence as a tool about new social order, and is the absolute fear of using violence. Both, and the first danger, this is proved by the experience of Bolshevism in our country, and it proves that socialism cannot be violently imposed on society. It can only progress of a democratic process by the self-activity of popular majority. But to win, to establish this institutional framework, it sometimes needs violence. And to win and defend these democratic institutions. And so we can make a difference between and defensive violence. And defensive violence is absolutely necessary for socialist movement. Historically, the violence of popular masses was the defensive violence. Even if we look at the Great French Revolution of the 18th century, the storming of Bastille was an act to destroy the oppressive institution and to win new institution, democratic institution. Sometimes socialists, they demonstrated the inability to use this necessary method. I can give you two historical examples. One example is the Weimar Germany. Social democratic movement was mystic. And though social democrats had their own paramilitary organization like Iron Front and Reichsbanner, avoided against Nazis And Nazis use all their paramilitary machine to destroy their democracy. Absolutely catastrophic. This is the negative example of non-violence. On the other hand, the same historical period, 1936, Britain. We can remember the so-called Battle of Cable Street. Rank and file labor activists and Jewish activists, they just came to the street and they were not afraid to confront not only Nazis from organizing their march, but also to confront police, fixing the legalistic norms. An example of progressive violence, justified violence. And this kind of violence, we can say, contributed to saving Britain from the fascist dictatorship. These historical examples demonstrate that violence to defend, and sometimes this is necessary. And I think that this is what Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels understood by dictatorship of the proletariat as the authoritarian despotic form of government, by dictatorship in the sense of defense. And I think this is historical experience is very important for situation too. If reactionary forces attack, you should know how to deal with them, using all kinds of possibilities and all kinds of methods in order to avoid catastrophic defeat.
I just have a question for Alexei, given what you just said. Was it not the case that the Bolsheviks acted defensively when they were?
No, because
let me finish my question. Yeah. The tremendous violence that occurred in the Civil War was what was at the root of that was the white counter-revolution, viciously attacking and conducting pogroms and wreaking havoc across the countryside. And the Bolsheviks and the Soviet government reacted to that and by defending the revolution in a desperate situation. So I don't see how that's in sync with some of your early statements about Bolshevism.
Yesterday, there was a very important historical date, 100 years from the dissolution of the first Russian democratic parliament, the Constituent Assembly. The absolutely democratic vote, which gave Bolsheviks about 24%. And nevertheless, 87% of deputies represented various socialist parties. Decided to dissolve it. There was a moment when the Bolshevik anarchist sailor called Zhelezniak went and said, okay, the guard is tired, so please go. And at the same time, about 50 people who went on march to defend the Constituent Assembly were shot by Bolshevik soldiers. The beginning of the Civil War, actually. The Bolshevik government, with 24% of popular support, could not be seen as legitimate, but by the majority of Russian population, mainly peasants. And the first act of civil war was not a war between Reds and Whites, but between Reds and the so-called Popular Army by the Constituent Assembly, which fought under the Red Banner. Tragedy. And we should make lessons from that.
Well, I don't want to divert us into a long discussion of the Russian question, which is complex and controversial to this day. But I would simply point out that in the meantime, in the period between the actual voting for the Constituent Assembly and the convening of it, the Bolsheviks had large majorities in most of the major Soviets around the country. And the Soviet form of government had replaced bourgeois democracy at that point.
Yes.
So we disagree on that, obviously, and we're not going to resolve it this But, I'll just make that point.
No, I don't disagree that Bolsheviks had serious support in city Soviets. Of course, they had a majority on the Congress of Soviets, of soldiers and workers. But you must understand that the workers constituted about 7%. How can you have a democratic government relying on 7%? But even they did not rely on the 7%. In 3 months after the dissolution of Constituent Assembly, they also dissolved major Soviets, where they lost elections to the Mensheviks and SRs. This happened in spring 1918, to the war. And this also had a character not of defensive, but of offensive violence, which should be avoided.
So I'm going to jump in. Dan, welcome back. So we're in our conversation about violence, and what's interesting is we've had a couple proposals that the strategic use of defensive violence is a vital part of the revolutionary process. Is there anyone who disputes that, who has a vision of a fully nonviolent progression response?
I wouldn't be in any way an absolutist about it. David, for example, spoke about the Deacons for Defense in Lowndes County, Alabama, represented some older people who supported the students and the youth and the women who were marching nonviolently. But they were just in the background, and they were grown men and veterans, many of them, and they were all quite obviously under their clothes packing iron. And that sort of equalized a situation. Now, I'm sorry, today we have another example of what I think many of us would agree form of defensive violence. I'm talking about Rohingya, and I'm talking about the militias, particularly of Kurdish women, who have, on the one hand, demythologized the whole idea that women are incapable of defending themselves, but on the other hand, are protecting themselves and the people in their area from aggression the only way that is possible under those circumstances. The problem is, and that's where we got on the slippery slide solution, is when exactly do you see that defensive violence suddenly becomes something quite different? And to me, that is about the state. The state is defined by its violence. It has the legitimate monopoly of organized violence in its territory, and it uses to keep the population in line and then to try and grab stuff from other countries that are also organized as the state. So there will never be peace or a lack of violence as long as there is the state organized that way. And to try and, at certain times in history, it's been possible to imagine that an armed uprising like the Bolsheviks, which was really a mass uprising of the Soviets, it was a Soviet revolution, but the Bolsheviks turned it into a way of taking over the sovereign state. Changed, whether immediately or a little later, the whole purpose of it. We're not for that. We're for a planetary commonwealth that will not be enforced by a minority on a majority, by the use of weapons, but which will be consensual. Now, I don't think there's any way in our day and age that you can get there. In the age of the French Revolution, even in 1848, even in a backward country like Russia in 1917, when guns were, you know, we're talking about machine guns and rifles and stuff like that. But today, the high-tech weapons of mass destruction, up to and including the atomic bomb, leader now says would be an appropriate example to cyber attack. Now, I have to say, like the character on Monty Python, that's where my case falls to the ground. Because with Harry and I had always conspired that cyber war is better than atomic war, because nobody dies, but people's systems go haywire, and the two opposite states paralyze each other, and then maybe some common sense and some human self-organization can take over. But if these morons really think that kind of a gesture can bring on atomic war, they seem to have absolutely no idea what nuclear winter is. So, you know, even though I couldn't understand a word that Sam said, I share his feeling. It is total madness. But the madness is not just the Neros that are thrown up at the top of the heap. They're the symptom. The madness is the capitalist system, which has now devoured the whole of the earth, cannot stop itself. It is a mechanism. It cannot cease accumulating endlessly and exploiting endlessly and expropriating commons endlessly. So unless there is a totally massive rising of human beings, there just isn't going to be a future. Well, go to the, you know, do something else with our time. But if there's any chance that there will be a future, there's no way we can win it by picking up the gun like Che Guevara or any of these other people, for a whole number of reasons. One is that the relation of forces in terms of the weaponry that they control is 1,000,000,000 to 1. Who knows what it is? It's just not going to happen. The second thing is that once it becomes a military confrontation, like it did when Syria's revolution degenerated, or Libya's, just a killing field where every nation state wants to put its iron in the fire in order to get advantages in a huge worldwide state against state 1917 type, for colonies, for world domination, for advantages, and so on. We've really gone back a full century. And although the 1914 war, which my dad told me all about, was the most violent and brutal that had ever been examined, ever been experienced by human beings, what we have today makes it pale. You know, they're still digging up ordnance in the north of France here. And there are whole countries like Afghanistan where there are little bombs that are painted to look like children's toys or animal turds that the farmer might want to plow under. You know, and this is going to go along long after capitalism is dead. Kids are going to continue having their hands blown off. And this is because it's a system. And yes, it produces crazy leaders. They'd have to be crazy. But our job and the job of the movement of revolutionaries is to see what's happening, to document it, to not be afraid, as many people on the left are, to come out of denial and admit that the chances are getting worse and worse. The question of nonviolence is, we used to believe that it required a lot of self-discipline and training and so on, and this may not be true, but there has to be an answer to the question of organization. Now, with your permission, I'd like to just read you the first paragraph of what I posted on this subject. And I had planned with Mati Monji, who's going to talk about specifically the Middle East and the Arab world, okay? And so we agree on this. I'm going to read a little bit about what I wrote at the time. Western readers fed on media stereotypes of Arabs and Muslims depicted as warlike tribal clansmen, violent religious fanatics, and gruesome terrorists. Perhaps the biggest surprise of the Arab Spring was their assimilation and effective deployment of the tactic of mass nonviolent resistance. The masses of Tunisia and Egypt spontaneously, without the guidance of charismatic leaders, deployed the historically proven tactics of nonviolent struggle. These included demonstrations and occupations of public space, civil disobedience, fraternization with the soldiers sent to repress them. These spontaneous mass actions were backed by prolonged political strikes among workers in key industries. By combining all these classic tactics, the Tunisian and Egyptian masses were able to topple two of the world's longest reigning dictators, backed by France and the US. And they did it in a matter of days. Clearly, these Arabs were onto something. Having lived all their lives in violent, repressive societies, the great crowds of Tunisians and Egyptians who together carried out this brilliant tactical victory understood instinctively that mass nonviolence was the only way to win, the only way to bring their real strength, their numbers, their courage, their solidarity to bear against the mega weaponry of the 21st century police state, which of course was being replenished day after day by the United States because they were running out of gas and shit like that, and helicopters. To me, the epitome of their creative nonviolence was the way thousands of Egyptian protesters on the bridge leading into Tahrir Square to the square through the police blockade after sustaining a day-long push and shove battle. Exhausted frontline resistors passed to the rear, ever new lines of brave protesters filtered up to the front. Nonviolence does not necessarily mean passive resistance. Mass action is necessarily cohesive and coercive, nor does nonviolence recognize the sanctity of bourgeois property, only of life. For example, starting in 2010, Egyptian textile workers, mainly women, barricaded themselves inside their owner's property. Sit-in strikes, factory occupations are forceful weapons which challenge bourgeois property and lead naturally to worker takeovers, as they did not so long ago in Argentina. Now, this goes on for some time, so I just would like to summarize some of the advantages of massive nonviolent resistance. First of all, it avoids the problem of macho male leaders taking over and provoking people to call the cops pigs, when in fact they can be neutralized and even sometimes won over, as happened briefly last month in Honduras, if you remember, when cops were interviewed and said, well, we can't break up these things. My mother back home, she's fighting, she's against the government. So, you know, all of the posturing and all the shit that brought on the weathermen and destroyed SDS, all of that which I lived through is just male posturing. What's great about nonviolence is that it flows from the conclusions we drew about women's role in revolution. Women being the primary workers and also those responsible for the care of children of the future. And they are less prone to that kind of macho posturing. In fact, there's no way we can win unless the women are in the battle and are the majority, because they are the majority. They started with the violence and all of that. The women don't come. The women filled Tahrir Square. And for the first time in Egyptian history, or I guess since Queen Cleopatra, men and women interacted as equals in that square. Stuff after they made their meals and all the rest of the things that were absolutely exemplary, as if they had read the manuals of nonviolent resistance that we studied in the 50s and early 60s in the civil rights movement, and then rehearsed, being cursed and themselves and so on. They didn't need that training. They instinctively knew what they needed to do. And one of the most important things about nonviolence is that it releases the creativity of women. And there's going to be no revolution or anything like it. Or if it is, if you can't dance it, I don't want to be there, just like. And finally, it avoids the problem, which is the twin of the macho male that's got to prove his testosterone by leading us into a fight with the cops. The agent provocateur, because from the very beginning, the police have infiltrated every movement that I've ever belonged to. And there were always people who come over out of the crowd and say, let's go this way and let's fight these people and so on and so forth. They're all paid. Or if they aren't, they're assholes. So the only way to have a kind of a, what do you put that, insect repellent, asshole repellent, go for a basic principle of nonviolence. And finally, and I see this all the time here in France, of course, the agent provocateur and some hot-headed youth who are desperate make use of mass demonstrations to go out and break store windows. Well, who the hell does that hurt? It only hurts somebody very likely like their parents, who are trying to make a living running a store. And it alienates all the middle-class people that have to be part of the mass coalition, what people are calling today the multitude, which, unless it is able to come together and emerge together, we'll never be able to overwhelm the capitalists. So you can't alienate that thing by that kind of behavior. And I've always felt that the black bloc people, if they want to fight cops, let them do it on their own time. The cops are already there. You can come 100 strong and break into the police station. Like Lenin, I would send them, applause. Although preaching against it, of course, but not when they come in our parade. They have no business there. And I've followed it very closely in France, where they have journalists and people with videos that see these people being exfiltrated, going and breaking windows, infiltrated through the police and then exfiltrated. There's just no doubt that for everyone who is just somebody who's trying to break a window, there are people who are being paid for it. So those are powerful reasons why we have to consider nonviolence as the main, if not the only road to a better world. Now, new things are coming up, and I'd like to create an agenda where we discuss them. I've never been a great fan of Negri and Hart, although I see that they've anticipated many, many, many things, but they have convinced themselves that capital is no longer creating a value in the traditional sense, but that their value is in creating subjectivities. I have no idea what that means. And I refuse, and I've always refused, even going back to Raya Dunayevskaya's Golden Reign, to believe something that I don't understand. So stick with capitalism and the profits that come from material production. On the other hand, multitude and this idea of the swarm is interesting. And in their latest book, Assembly, which I'm attempting to read, they talk about the difference between the old-fashioned forms of insurrection, whether it be the French Revolution or the Russian, where the aim was to smash and take over the state, that is to say, to impose sovereignty. Immediately that means repeating the same thing. There's going to be a top and a bottom. And decisions are, and sovereignty means the ability to make decisions. And so it's pointless to overthrow the state and replace it with another state, which inevitably becomes oppressive. And this is what we've seen in so many revolutions, especially the ones that were put in place by guerrilla struggles or other forms of violence. So they're trying to imagine of self-organization. And I wish I could understand the way they write, because they may be onto something. And there's another thing that's posted on our list here by a writer who is at least lucid. What the hell is the name of that? Where he talks about the swarm. But, you know, I've been approximating these ideas for years, since my original thesis of planetary consciousness, which dates from 1997. But that's what they're talking about when they talk about the hive mind and so on. They're talking about something that is very, very recent, planetary consciousness. And it's nothing mystical. It simply means that before, nobody knew that they were living on a round ball. And now almost everybody does. And of all of those people, the billions, those who are willing to come out from behind denial or can raise their head a moment from the struggle to keep alive from day to day, they know that this world and that their lives are threatened, that they're one step away from being climate refugees or war refugees, employed permanently, and all the rest of that stuff. So the question is, and this is a question that is posed to us as a unique group which has assigned ourselves a vital revolutionary task, as that quote from the Syrian points out. Let us try to imagine this. I am willing to sacrifice myself and read Hart and what's his name, and try and figure out what they're getting at. But clearly, the internet is one feature that enables us to relate, perhaps in different ways. And so the question of nonviolence, the organizational question, which we looked at before and which we're going to have to revisit. And as far as the question of self-defense is concerned, you know, I think it's one of these things that you have to look at each case. But if the end is not sovereignty, if it's not seizing state power, which is inevitably state power over somebody else, is the privilege of oppressing smaller minorities in the little enclave that you've just created for your own minority. So the questions of violence, nonviolence in the state, to me, and of capitalism itself, because all the state violence has one and only one purpose, right, of the capitalists to keep profiting from endless accumulation and to guard all the resources and to keep working people everywhere in line through violence, through hunger, through all of these fear. And so we need to go through fear. You've got to be willing to be scared if you want to participate in nonviolent revolution. I say this as a certified, if not totally religious, coward. But when the time comes, you've got to be there. That's all.
I'm going to jump in. So I keep getting kicked off, so I don't know. It's frustrating. But in any case, Fred is on deck, and I'd like to come and speak about fear a little bit later. And Dan, let me know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think some of the stuff that Richard was just saying about Harta Negri and sovereignty leads us back to the anarchist tradition, which I don't speak as an expert on that at all, but I do realize that the problem of reconstructing sovereignty, which really means reconstructing a state or replacing a state with another state. I was just reading James Scott's Against the Grain, which we've talked about a little bit before. But he points out that for centuries and centuries before the rise of states, it wasn't just primitive people, living in caves. There were organized communities of people who were engaging in agriculture, had an organized and cooperative and egalitarian lifestyle, and ways of life and ways of organizing themselves as societies long before states arose. And states arose not as an outgrowth of organization or as a higher level of organization, but rather more as parasitic formations where groups of armed individuals managed to impose themselves on cultivators and extract taxation, and then using the resources extracted, then aggrandized themselves and set up states and gradually created the notion of sovereignty. So the notion of sovereignty arises not as necessarily, not so much as an outgrowth of cooperative social organization, but arises much more out of parasitic formations that arise and feed off of and extract resources from organized societies. Another text besides Scott, and I think Scott probably cites it, is by one of my mentors in graduate school, Charles Tilley, who wrote a wonderful essay called State Making as Organized Crime.
Right.
And I'll try to find that and put it up. But in any event, if we're talking about doing away with sovereignty through the swarming of multitudes and the creation of assemblies, that's got to be fleshed out a lot more.
Right.
And I think the anarchists, provided us with some bases or some concepts, but how you operationalize that and how you get from, again, our problem of getting from then to now. What is the how of eliminating sovereignty? Because there are inevitably going to be groups and organized currents and bodies of armed individuals who will try to reimpose parasitism on the social order that arises. So you have to build in some kind of safeguards or antibodies or what have you to overcome that as you proceed toward a just and egalitarian social order. So it once again, it's the question of the state. How do you abolish the state? Do you abolish the state by creating a temporary state of your own, which didn't work out so well? Do we need to revisit Marx's writings on the Paris Commune and Lenin's State and Revolution and critique those from a not so much from an anarchist standpoint, which has been done to the nth degree already without a great deal of fruit, but critique it from maybe this fresh point of view of the assembly notion. So maybe we do need to read Hart and Negri and try to translate that into more useful terms. I don't know. Just throwing all that out there. It's just thinking off the top of my head about all this.
Could I just recommend that on the wiki, I have posted the definition of anarchism for the 1908 encyclopedia written by Kropotkin.
Huh.
And if you read it and didn't know the source of it, it sounds like something that came out of Latin America 10 years ago. Take a look at it. It's only 2 pages. Somebody's asking for the floor.
I asked for the floor. Can I have it?
David, speak.
I have a dissenting view, as usual, from what Richard said. Partially dissenting. Humanity is faced with the potential of climate catastrophe. I know that Sam may dissent from this too, but I think there's overwhelming evidence we're rapidly approaching tipping points to climate hell, but there is still time to act to prevent it. And state institutions have to be challenged. We can't simply wish away the state as the capitalist state as they exist. Neither the nation states nor the transnational institutions that dominate a political economy and environmental policy and so on. So this leads to a strategy, consideration of a strategy that in part is aimed at democratizing state institutions in partnership with the prefigurations from below that are being created. So it's, I think that Richard is oversimplifying what our challenges are in the real world. If the climate catastrophe will be inevitable unless we implement a prevention program in time. Nuclear war is not inevitable, but it's certainly a horrendous possibility. And so this leads to a serious consideration, I think, of what kind of political struggles we engage in, what kind of social movements. I'm convinced that we need to, again, invoking Lenin, we need to reload Lenin in this in the 21st century, in certainly one respect, in terms of using divisions among capital, isolating fossil capital, military industrial complex capital, and promoting a transition under capitalism of a global Green New Deal. And there are supporters all over the world of this, both in the global South, in Europe, and so on. And just to take the position that the state always degenerates, so we shouldn't challenge it. Okay, Richard didn't exactly say that, but to take the position that the state has always degenerated, this points to a pure anarchist strategy, which I think is not going to be adequate to meet our challenges. And just one other point. Scott's book was mentioned, Against the Grain. There's a very interesting account in the New Yorker, which discusses the origin of the state. And my very close friend, Tala Volk, wrote a book called From Quarks to Culture. I promised to write a review on this for the wiki, but I didn't get around to it. He has a different account of the origin of the state, but I think Scott's account, which Fred shared with us, I think makes a lot of sense. Sure, okay, that's how the state originated. So what do we do with the nation state and the transnational states now? Just pray they wither away, or challenge them and try to transform them in a eco-socialist path to the future?
We destroy them. We pay no attention to them. We let them collapse because there's nothing that we can do if we take that over. We need a different arrangement of people, not based on coercion. And there's just no way that you can separate the states from the privileged class.
I'm sorry, I don't agree. We have a different account of what class struggle can do. That's the good question. And pushing the limits of what is possible under a certain political economy, and then breaking out of those limits and constructing another, creating another society. And I'm in complete sympathy with the revolutionary consciousness, planetary consciousness. I call it a global subject. But how to get there, if we just accept and wish for the collapse of the system on us, we're going to hell.
No, we have to challenge them with you all the way.
We don't have time for that. We won't be able to climb out of let's say the collapsed buildings and the caves, and then construct a new society from this collapse. It sounds much like Derek Jensenism that you're promoting.
Well, I don't know who Derek Jensen is, but I want to say this.
Okay.
In terms of, because I'm a betting man, and I think the likelihood of us somehow influencing through party politics the American state so that it gives up nukes and stops subsidizing carbon rather than renewables, the chances of that, and of that happening fast enough before we've passed all the tipping points, I would say that the chance of having revolution next Thursday, because some movement starts someplace, just like the flapping of the butterfly wings that Manuel Wallerstein cites at the end of his lecture, where he talks about capitalist chaos and bifurcation. Something can just go viral and people can rise up. That is imaginable. Whereas I cannot see, and I challenge you, okay? I challenge you for the wiki to write a narrative in which work within the system such as you can imagine it, and I'm willing to give you all the best, outcomes and so on, happens, let's say, within the next 20 years, because I think you'll probably agree that in terms of tipping points, that's what we're looking at.
Richard, I did
write it up. Write it up.
I already did it. It's 2117. I posted that a few months ago. So critique that. I haven't seen a critique.
Okay, I'm going to jump in.
Right, I'm not going to say anymore.
No, it's great. I'm going to jump in because folks on the group chat are reminding us that that our purpose is to try to get to next steps. And I want to remind everyone that the premise of this is that all paths are possible. So David laid out his path, so it's our responsibility to read it and critique it for what it is, not for what we think it is or don't think it is. Fred wanted to say something.
I was going to say exactly what Jenny just said, which is what we're here for, is to lay out and consider different alternative ways in which we get to 2117. So again, David has one view of that and Richard has another, and we need to see it in the how section of the relevant wiki portion. And if David's already written it and we missed it, then we better go back and read it.
Yeah.
Where to find it? Tell us where to find it.
It's in the one of the folders. I don't remember which one, to tell you the truth.
All right, but it's not on the wiki.
There. It's definitely there. And you even complimented me on what I wrote. Richard, you have a short memory.
He's old.
Yes,
We all do.
I would like to join in, partly because we asked our internet service provider to give us better service, and ever since they did, we have worse service. So I've been kicked off this call at least 5 times. And the next time I will probably not rejoin because I'll be too frustrated. So I wanted to talk about, touch on the notion of fear for a moment. So this morning I posted on the wiki under how an excerpt, sort of the recommendation section of a policy analysis that I wrote for one of my classes in terms of addressing police violence. And so using the strategies that we use in youth development, which is my work, in training, not only working with young people, but also training adults to prepare themselves and their own egos for working with children who are living in trauma. So if you can, it's not too long. It's just the last couple pages of an essay. So there I really talk about violence as the result of fear. And in the whole piece, I talk about how police, I refer a lot to Omi and Wynant, who wrote this fantastic book on called Racial Formation, and also Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and just sort of talking about how police are trained with fear, and how their killing is the inevitable sort of result of where they are as emotional human beings when they enter a space with Black and brown people or poor people or whatever that is. And so to address those kinds of emotional needs, and Dad, I think you were the one who posted, hold on, I'm looking here, Gilligan's work on prisoners, and sort of like that idea of like what human beings need, right? That the idea of being recognized as a worthy person, of having a chance to exert yourself as a human in the world and in the world around you. That's so fundamental. So I put in just a little bit on restorative justice, which of course is an ancient indigenous practice, but has become in the last 2 years really a buzzword in education. And I'm hoping that it moves past being a fad and really becomes entrenched. And people are framing it as the way to break the school to prison pipeline. So there are some real authentic believers and practices, and then a lot of places where it's lip service because there's not time or understanding. But I posted a little bit about those, and I think part of our how has to be connecting as humans with emotions and with egos. And doing that work on ourselves. There, in one of the earlier chats, which I lost when you were talking about Tahrir Square, was reporting of sexual violence that took place in Tahrir Square, and how it still remains dangerous for women to sort of be in public spaces in general, and how we have to how are we going to move past that and address that in general? And Dad, you talked about, you know, you have to be willing to be afraid to embark in nonviolence. So there's really, it's a very interesting, but I think important conversation about the appropriate use of fear, or how we can change. I think for me, it's that definition of courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, but but being afraid and acting anyway. And so I think like how we develop, like the movement has to include how we develop that kind of courage. Because to me, violence, and this we spoke a lot about under the sort of women as vanguard, right? The whole idea of capitalism as violence, and violence against women, against the body, right? And sexual violence being such an important pillar. Like, I mean, can we imagine capitalism standing if it didn't have racism and misogyny as its sort of foundations, its foundational columns? So I just wanted to, you know, it's easy to read. I just wanted to put that out there as well. And to me, that doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be armed struggle or sort of that strategic use of defensive violence that Alexei and David were kind of talking about. I just literally can't imagine otherwise. That could be a failure of my imagination, but I just can't imagine otherwise. But I think that yeah, I've made my point.
You know, on the point that there's an echo. I don't know why now. Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so one thing that occurs to me is it's striking that there is no substantial organized current anywhere on the left globally that I can see now that advocates armed struggle as the road to revolution. There's no Guevarist or Debray or, you know, there's no pick up the gun, power to the people kind of rhetoric. What there is these, I mean, to the extent that violence on the part of the movement is a problem, it's the kind of black bloc stuff that Richard was talking about. But those folks are not in any way talking about making revolution, taking state power. It's just a striking out or of a kind of a visceral reaction to the shit that's going down. And they even, I mean, oftentimes they even present themselves as a form of self-defense, however wrong their approach is. So that you know, maybe we should count our blessings if we're not up against this this kind of politics that occurred in the 60s and 70s of people, you know, thinking that you could make a revolution just by you know, creating some armed groups and robbing banks or fighting cops or whatever.
That's a good point, Fred.
I put on the wiki, on the sheet of readings, which I hope people will continue to add to, whatever I could find, which was not a huge amount, on what happened in Honduras a few weeks ago, when troops trained by the US and the CIA and who were put in place for all the reasons that you could imagine, finally refused to leave their barracks and said that they didn't think their job was to put down the protesters. That kind of thing is to be looked at very, very carefully. Similar things happened, of course, in the Russian Revolution and other revolutions, and it's very important to know it. Mutiny is a very, very dangerous thing. If a few soldiers start to mutiny, the only way they can survive is to drag all the rest of them along with them. It's not something you can do halfway. And so things like that can develop and happen very, very rapidly. The more reason not to dehumanize the people that the capitalists hire to keep us in line. Humanize them, and at the same time, not to expect them to be anything less than violent if they're ordered to, because that's the other dangerous attitude on the part of first-timers in demonstrations and so on. You know, there's a group called Youth Against War and Fascism, which is a youth section of Marcy's Workers' World Party, which is still out there. And in fact, we have a friend who's part of that very nice, tall man that Jenny with. In any case, their tactic was to lead basically liberal or youthful protesters into a confrontation with the police in the belief that when they're exposed to the violence of the state, then they'll immediately become revolutionaries, as if the club of a policeman could pound into the head of a liberal Lenin's complete works. But it doesn't work that way.
Comrades, can I say some words also?
Yes.
I think that we must be more concrete and look at the examples of this non-violent resistance, when and how it could be effective. We know in history the examples of the effective, victorious non-violent resistance. Probably yes, we have these examples. For instance, the Velvet revolutions in Eastern and Central Europe, 1989-1990. When, for instance, in Czechoslovakia, where this term Velvet Revolution originated, the level of violence was lesser than under Thatcher. These non-violent mass mobilizations of Eastern European people, they brought down totalitarian and authoritarian regimes. Also, another example is Gandhism in India, which eventually led to the liberation of India from the British Empire. I think that all these examples have some common thing. Non-violent resistance prevail when the enemy is weak and enemy is paralyzed, is ready actually to capitulate. There can be also other examples. Look at Kosovo in 1990s. We had the so-called Albanian Kosovo Gandhi, called Ibrahim Rugova, who was the leader of the Kosovo Albanian resistance, Milosevic chauvinistic dictatorship. And for 6 years, from 1991 to 1996, they actually practiced this non-violent resistance with zero result. In 1996, humiliated and suppressed and ethnically cleansed for 6 years, they eventually decided to create their own armed organization called Kosovo Liberation Army. Surprise, this was not an accident. Logical outcome of the 6 years of ineffective resistance, because Milosevic regime was not ready to capitulate. Everything is conditioned by the situation. Richard knows more examples of effective nonviolent resistance. And one more point is about anarchists. Anarchists have their interesting conceptions of liquidating the state, but only one problem. The opportunity to test the ideas in practice, they actually go away from their theory. No movement in Ukraine during the Russian Civil War created his own revolutionary insurgent army, own quasi-republic. Anarchists in 1930s did the same. They even joined the Republican government. Kropotkin himself, this analysis of origins of the states before then against the grain with the same idealistic, anti-historical, I think, conception. Itself in 1917 and 18 advocated democratic republic, not. So let's look not on abstract ideas, but on historical experience of both anarchism and nonviolence.
Alexei, could you clarify the example of in Yugoslavia with Milosevic? I didn't quite get your point about the nonviolent.
Yes, you know that there was a region in Serbia called Kosovo.
Kosovo, yes.
Yes, this is populated by Albanian people, and
right.
they had their autonomy denied and suppressed by Milosevic, who began the policy of Serbization of this region. All cultural institutions, Albanian cultural institutions, were closed. All self-governed bodies was destroyed. This was actually a kind of genocide of Albanians. And Albanians, they protested and they began non-violent campaign of resistance in 1991. Yeah, they even managed to organize the clandestine referendum on the status of Kosovo with about 90% voting for independence. But Milosevic pursued his, and this led people to take up arms. Not surprising, understandable.
And what was
eventually had a success.
What was the result?
The result was an armed confrontation between Kosovo Liberation Army and the Serbia regime. The external forces intervened, and because the United Nations proclaimed this as a catastrophe, and now the Kosovo has an independent status.
So, in other words, the so-called democracies, the world nations, refused to come to the aid of the Kosovars when they were using nonviolent methods. But
yes, they went to their support in words. Of course, everybody was in solidarity.
Right, but as soon as they took up arms, then the world began to pay attention.
Yes, because this armed conflict is the of the grave state of this conflict. Arms, they see no other possibilities to defend themselves. This is the climax of the crisis.
What seems to me something logical is that the world state system defends itself and does not support anywhere, not in North Africa, not in Syria, nowhere do the democracies support democratic revolutionary movements, democratic nonviolent resistance movements for justice, whether it be ethnic justice or class justice or just plain democracy. No support ever comes, except words in the UN, which is total hypocrisy. So that finally the state system, which is based on violence, can only deal with violence.
And more so than even that, I think the state, can I speak?
Form of violence.
The states recognize their own, shall we say, and wherever state actors, state managers see a threat to state power by organized or by nonviolent masses of people in the streets and provoking mutinies and provoking the disintegration or the crisis of state power, they will intervene in order to shore up state power, regardless of who the immediate state represents. They can come in and, they will come in and try to prevent the overthrow of a state, regardless of what that state is. So that even in 1989, 1990, the uprisings in Eastern Europe were not looked on with friendly eyes, I think, by the so-called, Western democracies. They were nervous. They were, concerned that state power was in trouble and in crisis, and they worry and try to prevent social upheavals that arise, upon the overthrow of a repressive regime. So another case that we didn't bring up today, but there were some good things posted online about, was the case of Iran, where despite facing tremendous repression over a period of months and years, the Iranian masses in 1979 managed to provoke mutinies in the Shah's armed forces and overthrow the Shah's regime. But again, parasitic, state builders gained control of the situation and created a new state apparatus based on the Islamic Republic, and suppressed the democratic movements of masses. So, what I would conclude from what Alexei has outlined and what Richard was saying is nonviolent mass movements can be very effective and have been very effective in overthrowing old regimes, decayed dictatorships, that sort of state formations. But they have not been very successful, unfortunately, in creating truly democratic and participatory regimes in the aftermath of those state collapses and overthrows. And that's where the issue for us is how do we get from the successful overthrow of an old regime to the construction of a just and democratic and participatory and egalitarian social order.
But it's a different problem from the problem of violence. How to create something new.
Yes.
Well, I think part of the solution is that it must be transnational. That's for openness. Well, I see that it's 5 minutes of whatever time it is in New York. 1, right?
1.
Yes. And in Moscow, what time is it?
9 p.m.
9 p.m.
So 9
well,
p.m.
In absence of Jenny, who excused herself, I'd like to thank you all who are still online for your participation, and we'll continue on the same topic next week, but trying more and more to construct alternate scenarios based on our reading, and in the reports to use the reading to present them not just off the top of the head, but to see what we get out of them. Does anyone want to make some final comments before we turn off? Alexei?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I just also point out next week. Hopefully, we can get Brian and Peter and a few other, and Sam Friedman to give us their thoughts on all of this.
All of these people I spoke to by telephone yesterday. I just don't understand it, but that's life.
See you next week.
We'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Take care. See you all later.
Bye-bye.